There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And Pilate, through this conversation, Pilate concluded that Jesus was not a threat to Rome, and that Jesus, he wasn't a dangerous revolutionary, where Pilate himself said, I find no fault in him. He's innocent. And at this point, it should have been all over, because Pilate, he had the authority to release Jesus, but he doesn't release Jesus. And that's because this is all political. This was all about how Pilate, who hated the Jews, had to appease the Jews, because Pilate was on a short leash with Rome, and he was on his very last straw with Caesar Tiberius. Because you have to realize the only reason that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea was because he had married Caesar Augustus's granddaughter. And he had been appointed to that position of governor by Caesar Augustus's son, Caesar Tiberius. And just as much as Pilate hated the Jews hated Pilate. That's because Pilate was a cruel and cowardly man, and he covered up his cowardice by his acts of violence. Where Pilate, at one time, he had brought these pagan images into Jerusalem to be worshiped. And this got him into a lot of trouble with not only the Jews, but it also got him in trouble with Caesar Tiberius. And so Pilate, he couldn't afford any more trouble. And so this judgment of Jesus, it had to be handled not fairly, but diplomatically. So Pilate, he's trying really hard to come up with some kind of compromise. So not to upset the Jews, but also not to condemn Jesus. Because Pilate knew that Jesus was not guilty of anything, but that the Jews had only delivered him up because of envy. And so just within these few hours, because this is Friday morning, and all of this is happening before 9 o'clock a.m. But Pilate, in that time, he tries to release Jesus 5 times. But the Jews, they would have none of that. And Pilate, he's a very shrewd man, and he thinks he finds a solution. He finds a solution to his problem because there is a loophole where Pilate can use this custom of the Jews of releasing one prisoner at the Passover. And so Pilate, he picks the most vile criminal he has in custody. This man is an insurrectionist, which means he was a robber, and he was also a murderer. And so Pilate, he picks Barabbas. And the name Barabbas, it means the son of the Father. And if you look at the early manuscripts of Matthew, it includes Barabbas's full name, where his actual full name was Jesus Barabbas. And we know that Barabbas's name was Jesus because the early church, they also confirmed that Barabbas's first name was Jesus. And so that sounds really surprising, but that really shouldn't be that surprising to us because Jesus was a common name. It's just the Greek translation of the name Joshua. But here we have Jesus, the son of the Father, which is Barabbas, Jesus Barabbas. And now we have Jesus of Nazareth, who is also the only son of a father, which is the Father God. And Barabbas is what we would call a domestic terrorist. And because of that, Pilate here, he thinks he has a sure thing because they surely wouldn't release a violent criminal over condemning some fabricated criminal, an innocent man like Jesus who had never done anything wrong. He had only helped the people. But while Pilate is there and he's still sitting on the judgment seat, and before he makes his final judgment, he gets this message from his wife, and it's urgent. And you don't get the sense that she's done this before. And I'm pretty sure that she wasn't calling Pilate every day, going to tell him all her dreams. That's because Pilate is Caesar's man in Jerusalem. He's the governor, and Pilate is in the middle of a trial. And this trial happens to be on the biggest Jewish holiday, which was also the most important holiday. And so he probably wants to get home to the feast. It's kind of like us trying to get home to Thanksgiving dinner and, maybe go watch some football or whatever they watched back then. And Pilate's wife says, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." But Pilate, he didn't listen to his wife. But you can see right here that God, he's trying to get through to Pilate. He's trying to get through to Pilate in a way that he understands, in a way where Pilate can actually hear God. Because God, he's trying to warn this pagan Roman governor about what he's about to do. And it's just like how God had warned Judas and how God had warned Peter. Because the truth is, Pilate, he didn't have to do this. But Pilate, he didn't think what happens next could happen. Because we're told that it's not a natural response for the crowd to ask for Barabbas. But the crowd, they were worked up by the chief priests and by the elders. And that's very possible. And it actually could make sense because to Rome, Barabbas was considered a terrorist. But to the Jews, Barabbas could have been considered to be a freedom fighter. And by some of the Jews, he could have also been considered to be a hero, where a vote for Barabbas's release would be a vote against Rome. But however they thought, the release of Barabbas was incited by the Jewish leaders. And the words that are used to describe Barabbas is the same words that were used to describe the two other criminals that were crucified on both sides of Jesus. And so that cross that Jesus died on, it was actually the cross that was intended for Barabbas. And this should all take us all back in our memories and remind us about the scapegoat offering back in Leviticus 16, where on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, which happens to be the Jewish New Year, the high priest, he would take 2 goats and he would cast lots over the goats. And one would be taken for the Lord and the other was the scapegoat. And the Lord's goat would be offered up as a sin offering for the people of Israel, for all their sins and for all their transgressions. But the scapegoat, he would be presented alive before the Lord. And the high priest would lay his hands on the head of the live goat, and the priest would confess all the sins of Israel and all of their transgressions. And he would put those sins and transgressions on the head of that live goat, the scapegoat. And then they would take the goat and they would set him free into the wilderness. And it would be carrying the sins of the people away, never to be remembered again. And that's what's literally happening here, where Jesus is not only sacrificed here for the sins of Israel, but he's being sacrificed for the sins of the whole world. And all of that sin is being placed on him. And here we can see where Barabbas was literally set free and where Jesus is literally dying in Barabbas's place on that cross that was meant for Barabbas. And he's actually being crucified between Barabbas's 2 friends. But the reality is that Jesus did that for all of us. He didn't just do it for Barabbas. He actually died in our place for every one of us. He took the place on all of our crosses. All right. So Pilate here, before he releases Barabbas, he asks the crowd, he says, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" And you can see clearly here that Pilate, he doesn't want to condemn Jesus. And it's not because Pilate is kind and compassionate, but it's because I believe Pilate really believes Jesus is the Christ. And now the crowd, they shout for blood. And they say, crucify him. And now Pilate, he starts to defend Jesus. And he says, why? What evil has he done? And they just start chanting, crucify him. Let him be crucified. And now there's a riot breaking out. And Pilate, he can't afford to have a riot break out. And so Pilate, he washes his hands and he says, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And no matter how hard Pilate wanted to believe that, it wasn't true. And history records that it was under Pontius Pilate that Jesus suffered and died, because it was Pilate's full responsibility to give Jesus a fair trial. And he couldn't pawn off his responsibilities to anyone else, no matter how badly he wanted to. Jesus died under Pilate's authority. But the people in the crowd, they're willing to let Pilate believe whatever he wants to believe. And so they say, I'll take the responsibility. Let his blood be upon us and our children. And Jesus' blood was upon them. I'm not so sure it was on their children, but I know that his blood was still on Pilate's hands, no matter how many times he washed them. And then Pilate, he released Barabbas. And then Pilate has Jesus scourged. And a scourge is a whip. And it's a whip with many long pieces of leather strips. It's like a cat o' nine tails, but it has sharp metal and bone and embedded into the leather. And it was created to tear off the flesh of its victims. And many of the prisoners, they died from just a scourging. And most victims, they lost consciousness during the scourging. And after Jesus was scourged, the soldiers abused him. And you have to realize these men weren't good men. They were hardened men because they did this kind of work every day, day in and day out. And so they had no conscience. Their conscience had to be seared just to be able to perform that type of sadistic work that they had to carry out every day. So these are cynical men who found pleasure in their work, torturing the weak. And so they play this game with Jesus, Ave Caesar or Hail Caesar. And they put on Jesus this nasty old robe. And in Matthew here, it says that the robe was scarlet. But in Mark's gospel, it says it was purple, which tells us this is a reddish purple robe, which is the perfect description of a faded old garment. And then there was a crown of thorns that was pressed into the flesh of his forehead, with them spitting on him and striking him. And they're saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And it doesn't say it here in Matthew, but in John's gospel, we're told that Pilate brings Jesus out one more time. And he appeals to the pity of the Jews. And Pilate says, Behold the man. But it made absolutely no difference because they had no pity. People aren't changed by Jesus by having pity for him.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.